I never thought I'd live to see 82. And honestly, there were many years when I prayed I wouldn't. My name is Doris Stallworth, and I'm sitting here in my living room in Alabama, surrounded by pictures of my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. People who call me Grandma Doris and think I'm the sweetest old lady you'd ever want to meet. They see my gray hair and my gentle smile, and they have no idea that the hands that bake their cookies and brush their hair are the same hands that once shook so violently I couldn't hold a cup of water. They don't know that this voice that tells them bedtime stories is the same voice that once screamed into pillows night after night, begging God to make it stop. You see, when I was a little girl growing up right here in Jasper, the person who was supposed to love me most in this world, my own mother, she turned my 5 brothers against me in ways that still make my stomach turn. Every single night, she would send them to my room, and what happened next was so terrible that by the time they were finished, I would be unconscious on the floor. I was 8 years old when it started, and by the time I was 12, I had already figured out exactly how I was going to end my life. I had it all planned out, right down to the last detail. But then something happened that I never expected, something that changed everything, and the person who saved me was someone I never would have imagined could change the course of my entire life. This is my story of what happened in the small town of Jasper, Alabama, where everybody knew everybody's business, except nobody knew mine. It's about how the people who shared my blood, who sat at the same dinner table every night, who went to church with me every Sunday morning, became the very people I feared most when the sun went down. It's about the rage that grew inside me like a poison, how I spent years planning exactly how I would make them pay for what they did to me, how that anger nearly turned me into something I never wanted to become. But most of all, it's about a woman I met at the town market one ordinary Tuesday morning, someone who had absolutely no reason to care about a broken teenage girl with bruises she tried to hide under long sleeves. Someone who looked at me and saw something worth saving when I couldn't even see it myself. What happened next changed everything, not just for me, but for my entire family, for the whole town of Jasper, and it ended in a courtroom where secrets that had been buried for years finally came to light. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you might just change how you see your own life, your own struggles, and your own ability to survive things you never thought you could. If you can, please leave in the comments where you're watching this old lady from. It warms my heart to know that my voice is reaching far, maybe even places I never had the chance to visit. And if you like my story, please leave a like and subscribe to Grandparents Archives. It helps us to keep sharing meaningful stories like this. I was born in 1943 in Jasper, Alabama, a town so small that if you blinked while driving through, you'd miss it entirely. We had one main street, a handful of shops, a church on every corner, and the kind of place where your neighbors knew what you had for breakfast before you finished eating it. My daddy died when I was just 3 years old, a heart attack that took him so fast we barely had time to say goodbye. That left my mama, Eleanor, to raise 6 children all by herself. My brothers were James, Robert, Thomas, William, and Henry, and when I was 8 years old, they ranged from 10 to 18. Before Daddy died, our house was different. I remember laughter. I remember James teaching me how to skip stones down by the creek. I remember Robert letting me help him with his homework, even though I was too young to understand it. But after Daddy was gone, Mama changed into someone I didn't recognize. She became this hard, angry woman who seemed to blame the world for taking her husband away. And somehow, in ways I still don't fully understand, she decided that I was the one who deserved to pay for it. Jasper should have felt like home to me. It's where I learned to walk, where I said my first words, where I should have felt safe and loved. Instead, it became the place where I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from. My mama, Eleanor, had this way of making my brothers do whatever she wanted, and what she wanted was for them to hurt me in ways that no child should ever be hurt. It started on a Tuesday night in October when I was 8 years old. I remember it was Tuesday because that was the night Mama always did the washing, and I could hear the old washing machine clanking away in the back room when she called my brothers into the kitchen. I was in my bedroom trying to finish my arithmetic homework by the light of that old lamp with the torn shade when I heard her voice get that particular tone, the one that made everyone in the house freeze. She told them that I had been disobedient, that I had talked back to her earlier that day, though I honestly couldn't remember saying anything wrong. She said I needed to learn respect, and that since Daddy wasn't there to teach me, it was their job now. When they came into my room that first night, I could see in their faces that they didn't want to be there. James, my oldest brother, kept looking at the floor. Robert's hands were shaking, but Mama was standing right there in the doorway, watching, making sure they did exactly what she told them to do. They hit me not just slaps, but real hits that left marks on my arms and back. They said terrible things to me, words that cut deeper than any physical pain ever could. And when I cried, when I begged them to stop, they would just look at Mama and she would nod and they would keep going. The worst part wasn't even the hitting. It was when they would drag me to that little closet under the stairs and lock me in there in complete darkness. I was so small that I could barely breathe in that tiny space, and I would bang on the door until my knuckles bled, screaming for someone to let me out. Sometimes I would be in there for hours, until I couldn't scream anymore, until everything went black, and I would wake up on the closet floor with Mama standing over me, telling me that this is what happened to little girls who didn't mind their mothers. Every single night, they would come to my room. Every single night, I would beg them to stop. And every single night, they would look at me with these sad, scared eyes and say, "Mama says we have to, Doris. Mama says this is the only way you'll learn." I stopped feeling like their sister. I stopped feeling like I belonged to this family. I stopped feeling like I was worth anything at all. By the time I turned 12, I had been living this nightmare for 4 years and I couldn't see any way out. I would lie in my bed during the day when everyone else was gone, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, and all I could think about was how to make it stop. I tried running away twice, but Jasper is a small town, and somebody always brought me right back home to Mama, who would just smile sweetly at whoever had found me and thank them for being such good neighbors. Then, as soon as that door closed, the punishment would be twice as bad as usual. I started walking to Blackwater Creek every afternoon after school. It was about a mile from our house, through the woods where nobody could see me. There was this old wooden bridge that crossed over the deepest part of the creek, and I would stand there for hours, looking down at that dark water moving underneath me. The water was always moving, always going somewhere else, somewhere better than where I was. I would imagine what it would feel like to just step off that bridge, to let the water carry me away from Mama, away from my brothers, away from that house where I never felt safe. I had it all figured out. I knew exactly how I would do it. I even wrote a letter once explaining why I couldn't stay anymore, but then I tore it up because I realized nobody would care enough to read it anyway. I would stand on that bridge, gripping the wooden railing so tight my knuckles turned white, and I would count to 3 over and over again. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. But every time I got to 3, something would stop me. Not something big or dramatic, just this tiny voice in my head that would say, "Not today, Doris. Maybe tomorrow, but not today." I couldn't understand where that voice was coming from. It wasn't hope, because I didn't have any hope left. It wasn't fear, because I had been living in fear for so long that dying actually seemed peaceful. It was something else, something I couldn't name then, but I understand now. It was the part of me that Mama and my brothers had managed to destroy, yet the part that still believed, somewhere deep down, that maybe this wasn't all there was for me. Maybe somewhere out there was a different kind of life, a life where I mattered, where I was safe, where somebody might actually be glad I was alive. When I turned 15, something changed in me. I can't tell you exactly what it was or when it happened, but one morning I woke up and instead of that familiar feeling of dread, I felt angry. Really, truly angry for the first time in my life. Not the sad, helpless kind of crying angry, but the kind of anger that made my hands shake and my jaw clench so tight it hurt. I was tired of being scared. I was tired of being hurt. And I was tired of letting them win. So I started fighting back. The first time James came into my room with that same apologetic look on his face, I didn't just lie there and take it. I kicked him as hard as I could, right in the shin, and when he yelped and grabbed his leg, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, power. When Robert tried to grab my arm to drag me to that closet, I bit his hand so hard I drew blood. He jerked back and stared at me like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Neither could I. Of course, Mama made them hurt me worse after that. Much worse. But I didn't care anymore because at least now I was hurting them back. I started running away more often, not to go home to relatives or neighbors who would just bring me back, but to hide. I found this old abandoned barn about 3 miles from town, owned by the Henderson family who had moved to Birmingham years ago. I would stay there for days at a time, sleeping in the hay loft, stealing vegetables from people's gardens and apples from their trees, just to have something to eat. But every time I came back home, because where else was a 15-year-old girl going to go in 1958, the punishment got worse. Mama would lock me in that closet for entire days now, not just hours. She would make my brothers hold me down while she hit me with Daddy's old leather belt until I couldn't sit down for a week. And the whole time, she would tell me that this was my fault, that if I would just learn to be a good girl, none of this would have to happen. That's when the really dark thoughts started coming. I would lie in that closet or in my bed with fresh bruises all over my body, and I would plan exactly how I was going to make them pay for what they had done to me. I would imagine waiting until Mama was asleep and then setting the house on fire. I would picture myself putting something in their food that would make them sick, make them suffer the way I had suffered. I even thought about taking Daddy's old hunting rifle from the closet I thought about things that scare me to think about. The anger was like a living thing inside me, growing bigger and hungrier every day. I would catch myself staring at Mama across the dinner table, imagining all the ways I could hurt her, and the intensity of those thoughts terrified me. I didn't want to become someone who could hurt people the way I had been hurt. But I also couldn't stop the rage from building up inside me like pressure in a boiler, and I knew that someday something was going to have to give. I met Clara Thompson on a Saturday morning in March of 1959. I was 16 then, and I had walked to the town market to buy flour for Mama, one of the few times she let me out of the house alone. I was trying to count out the coins in my hand, making sure I had enough money when I dropped them all over the floor. As I was scrambling around on my hands and knees picking up pennies and nickels, this pair of sensible brown shoes appeared right in front of me. "Here, child, let me help you with that," said this voice that was different from any voice I'd heard in years. It was gentle but not weak, kind but not pitying. I looked up and saw this woman, probably around 60 years old, with silver hair pinned back neatly and these sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. She bent down and helped me gather up the coins, and when she handed them back to me, she paused. "Those are some nasty bruises on your arms, honey," she said quietly. "How did you get them?" Nobody had ever asked me that question before. Nobody had ever even acknowledged that the bruises existed. I was so used to people in town looking right through me, pretending they didn't see the marks on my face or the way I walked sometimes when my ribs were still healing. I just stood there staring at her, not knowing what to say. "I'm Clara Thompson," she said. "I used to teach 4th grade at the elementary school before I retired. And you're Eleanor Stalwart's daughter, aren't you?" Doris? I nodded, still not trusting my voice to work properly. Well, Doris, I think you and I need to have a conversation. There's a little cafe down the street. Why don't you come have a cup of coffee with me after you get your mama's flower? I should have said no. I should have made some excuse and hurried home like I always did. But something about the way she looked at me, really looked at me, like I was a person worth looking at, made me want to follow her anywhere. An hour later, I was sitting across from Clara Thompson in Murphy's cafe, holding a warm cup of coffee in my hands and telling her things I had never told another living soul. I told her about Mama and my brothers and the closet and the bridge over Blackwater Creek. I told her about the anger that was eating me up from the inside, about the terrible things I wanted to do to my family. And she listened to every word without interrupting, without looking shocked or disgusted or like she was sorry she had asked. When I finished talking, she was quiet for a long time. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. Doris, she said, what's happening to you is wrong. It's not your fault, and it's not something you have to live with for the rest of your life. But revenge isn't going to fix it. Revenge is just going to make you into someone you don't want to be. She told me I could come stay with her anytime I needed to. She lived alone in a little white house on Elm Street. Her husband had died 5 years earlier and they never had children. She said she had an extra bedroom and plenty of food, and that nobody would hurt me in her house. I didn't believe her at first. Adults had been letting me down my entire life, but something about Clara was different. When she looked at me, she saw someone worth saving. When she spoke to me like I mattered. And when she offered me safety for the first time in my life, I believed that maybe someone really could keep me safe. I lived with Clara on and off for 2 years, sneaking back to her house whenever the beatings got too bad, whenever I couldn't take another night in that closet. Clara never asked questions when I showed up at her back door at 2 a.m. with a split lip or bruises on my neck. She would just make me a warm bath, give me clean clothes, and let me sleep in her spare bedroom with the door locked. In the morning, she would make pancakes, and we would sit at her kitchen table while she helped me figure out what to do next. By the time I turned 18 in 1961, Clara had been telling me for months that I needed to go to the police. She said what Mama and my brothers were doing to me was against the law, that there were people whose job it was to stop this kind of thing. But I was terrified. Mama had always told me that if I ever told anyone our family business, something terrible would happen. She said nobody would believe me anyway, that everyone in town knew I was a troublemaker and a liar. But Clara kept pushing. She said I was an adult now, that I had choices I didn't have when I was a child. She said she would go with me, that she would sit right there beside me and make sure I got through it. So on a Thursday morning in June, Clara and I walked into the Jasper police station together. Sheriff Morrison was a big man with a gray mustache who had known my family for years. When I told him what I had come to report, he looked at me like I had just told him the sky was green. Now, Doris, he said, those are some pretty serious accusations you're making against your mama and your brothers. You sure about all this? But Clara spoke up before I could lose my nerve. Sheriff Morrison, she said in that teacher's voice that meant business, this young woman has been brutalized for 10 years. She has scars all over her body, and I've seen them with my own eyes. I think the least you can do is investigate. It took 3 days of questioning, but eventually my brothers started talking. James broke first. He was 28 years old by then, married with children of his own, and I think the guilt had been eating at him for years. He told the sheriff everything. Then Robert confessed, then Thomas, then William, then Henry. One by one, they admitted what they had done to me all those years. And every single one of them said the same thing. Mama made us do it. We didn't want to hurt Doris, but Mama said we had to. When they arrested Mama in July of 1961, She looked at me across that courtroom with such hatred in her eyes that I actually took a step backward. "You ungrateful little witch," she hissed. "After everything I did for you, this is how you repay me?" The trial started in September, and it seemed like the whole town of Jasper turned against me overnight. People I had known my entire life crossed the street to avoid walking past me. Women in the grocery store would whisper and point when I walked by. Someone even threw a rock through Clara's front window with a note tied to it that said "liar" in big black letters. But the worst part was sitting in that courtroom day after day, having to listen to the details of my own abuse read out loud in front of everyone I had ever known. Having to answer questions from Mama's lawyer, who tried to make it sound like I was making the whole thing up for attention. Having to look at my brothers sitting there at the defendant's table, knowing that even though they had confessed, part of me still loved them and wished things could have been different. There were days when I wanted to give up, when I wanted to tell the judge that I had made it all up just so it would stop. But every time I felt like I couldn't take another minute, I would look over at Clara sitting in the front row, and she would catch my eye and mouth the words, "You're braver than you know." And somehow, that was enough to get me through one more day. The verdict came on a cold February morning in 1962. I remember it was snowing lightly, which was unusual for Alabama, and Clara and I had to walk carefully on the icy courthouse steps. We had been going to that courthouse every day for months, and I knew every crack in the sidewalk, every chip in the paint on those big wooden doors. But that morning felt different. The air felt different. Even the way people looked at me felt different. Judge Patterson was an old man who had been on the bench for 30 years, and he had this way of looking over his glasses that made everyone in the room go completely silent. When he called the court to order that morning, you could have heard a pin drop. I was sitting in the front row next to Clara, and my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit on them to keep them still. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, Judge Patterson said, "This court finds Eleanor Stallworth guilty of aggravated child abuse and endangerment." I heard the words, but it took a few seconds for them to really sink in. Guilty. After all these years, after all the nights I thought no one would ever believe me, after all the times Mama told me I was worthless and deserved everything that happened to me, a judge had just said she was wrong. She was guilty. The judge sentenced Mama to 8 years in the state prison. 8 years for 10 years of abuse. It didn't seem like enough, but Clara squeezed my hand and whispered, "It's over, honey. She can't hurt you anymore." My brothers got lighter sentences because they had cooperated with the investigation, and because the judge said their young age at the time was a mitigating factor. James got 2 years. Robert got 18 months. Thomas, William, and Henry each got 1 year. But more than the jail time, what really cut deep was what happened afterward. One by one, they all cut me out of their lives completely. No letters, no phone calls, no attempts to explain or apologize, or try to repair what had been broken. It was like I had never existed. James moved his wife and children to Mobile and never spoke to me again. Robert joined the army, and I heard through other people that he was stationed in Germany, but he never wrote. Thomas, William, and Henry all stayed in Alabama, but acted like they had never had a sister named Doris. At family funerals years later, they would look right through me like I was invisible. That hurt worse than I expected it to. Even after everything they had done to me, part of me had hoped that once the truth was out in the open, we could find some way to be a family again. I thought maybe they would thank me for finally speaking up, for ending something that had been destroying all of us. But instead, they chose to hate me for telling the truth rather than hate Mama for making them participate in the lies. The town of Jasper split right down the middle. About half the people supported me and said they were proud of me for having the courage to speak up. The other half thought I was a vindictive daughter who had destroyed her own family for attention. Mrs. Henderson, who lived 2 houses down from Clara, stopped speaking to both of us. But Mr. Peterson, who ran the hardware store, would always give me a kind nod when I came in and never charge me full price for anything I needed. Clara helped me through all of it. She taught me that forgiveness didn't mean pretending the abuse never happened or excusing what Mama and my brothers had done. It meant releasing the anger that was poisoning me from the inside. She said holding on to hatred was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Doris, she would tell me when I would cry about losing my brothers, you can't make people love you the way you need to be loved. But you can love yourself enough to walk away from people who hurt you, even if they're family. She helped me apply to the community college in Birmingham. She taught me how to drive her old blue Buick. She showed me how to balance a checkbook and how to cook meals for myself and how to look people in the eye when I spoke to them. Basic things that most people learn from their parents, but that I had never been allowed to learn. Most importantly, she taught me that what had happened to me didn't define who I was or who I could become. She said I could choose to let the abuse make me bitter and suspicious of everyone, or I could choose to let it make me compassionate toward other people who were hurting. She said I could spend the rest of my life being Eleanor Stalwart's damaged daughter, or I could figure out who Doris was when nobody was hurting her. When the gavel fell that day in February and the judge declared Mama guilty, I cried harder than I had ever cried in my life. But they weren't tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of relief. I cried for that 8-year-old girl who had prayed every night for someone to believe her. I cried for the 12-year-old who had stood on that bridge wanting to die. I cried for the teenager who had been so full of rage she scared herself. And I cried tears of gratitude for the woman sitting next to me who had seen something worth saving in a broken girl buying flour at the market. For the first time in my life, I felt free. Not just free from Mama and my brothers, but free from the shame and fear that had been weighing me down for so long. Clara was right. I could start over. I could decide who I wanted to be, where I wanted to live, what kind of life I wanted to build. The little girl who had been locked in closets and beaten until she passed out was finally safe. And the woman she had become was ready to find out what came next. After the trial ended, I knew I couldn't stay in Jasper. Too many people knew my story, and everywhere I went, I could feel their eyes on me. Some sympathetic, some judgmental, but all of them seeing me as that poor stalwart girl who had been abused by her family. I needed to go somewhere where I could just be Doris, not a victim, not a survivor, just a regular young woman trying to figure out her life. Clara helped me move to Birmingham in the spring of 1962. I was 19 years old, and I had never lived in a city before. The noise and the traffic and all those strangers scared me at first, but it also felt like freedom. Nobody in Birmingham knew about my mama or my brothers or what had happened in that courthouse in Jasper. I could walk down the street without anyone whispering about me behind their hands. I got a job as a secretary at an insurance company downtown, and I rented a tiny apartment above a bakery that always smelled like fresh bread. It wasn't much, just one room with a bed and a hot plate and a bathroom I shared with the other tenants, but it was mine. Nobody could hurt me there. Nobody could lock me in a closet. Nobody could make me afraid to go to sleep at night. Clara drove down from Jasper to visit me every few weeks, and she would always bring me something. A casserole dish for my little kitchen, some curtains she had sewn for my windows, books she thought I might like to read. But mostly she brought me conversation and encouragement. She would sit on my one chair while I sat on the bed, and we would talk for hours about my job, about the college classes I was taking at night, about the future I was building for myself. In 1964, I met David at a church social. He was 25, worked as a mechanic, and had the kindest brown eyes I had ever seen. The first time he asked me out, I was so nervous I almost said no. I had never been on a real date before, and I didn't know how to tell him about my past without scaring him away. But Clara told me that the right person would love me for who I was, including the hard parts of my story, and that anyone who couldn't handle my history wasn't worth my time. When I finally told David about my childhood, about the trial, about why I had moved to Birmingham, he listened without saying a word. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Doris, I'm sorry that happened to you, but it doesn't change how I feel about you. If anything, it makes me admire you more for how strong you are." We got married in 1965 in a small ceremony at Clara's church in Jasper. She walked me down the aisle since I didn't have a father to do it, and she cried harder than I did during the whole service. David and I moved into a little house on the outskirts of Birmingham, and for the first time in my life, I understood what a real home felt like. It was quiet and peaceful and safe. When David came home from work, he would kiss me hello instead of wondering what I had done wrong that day. When we disagreed about something, we talked it through instead of someone getting hurt. We had 3 children, Clara in 1967, named after the woman who saved my life, then Michael in 1969, and Sarah in 1972. From the moment each of them was born, I made myself a promise that I would never, ever let anyone hurt them the way I had been hurt. But more than that, I promised I would show them every single day that they were loved and wanted and valuable just for being themselves. Being a mother terrified me at first. I had no idea what a good parent looked like because I had never had one. I was constantly afraid that I would accidentally do something to damage my children the way my mama had damaged me. But Clara would remind me that the very fact that I was worried about being a good mother meant I was already better than Eleanor had ever been. Doris, she would tell me when I called her in a panic because baby Clara wouldn't stop crying. You love your children. That's the most important thing. Everything else you can learn. And I did learn. I learned how to comfort them when they had nightmares instead of punishing them for waking me up. I learned how to discipline them with words and consequences instead of fists and closets. I learned how to listen to them when they were upset instead of telling them their feelings didn't matter. Most importantly, I learned how to tell them I loved them every single day, something no one had ever said to me when I was growing up. As my children got older and started asking questions about their grandparents, I struggled with how much to tell them. I didn't want to burden them with the ugliness of my childhood, but I also didn't want to lie to them. Eventually, I decided to tell them age-appropriate versions of the truth, that my family had hurt me when I was little, that Clara had helped me get safe, and that this was why we didn't visit Grandma Eleanor or their uncles. When Clara died in 1980, I felt like I had lost the only real mother I had ever known. She was 76 years old and had been sick for months, but I wasn't prepared for how empty the world felt without her in it. At her funeral, person after person got up to talk about how Clara had helped them, former students whose lives she had changed, neighbors she had cared for when they were sick, other young people she had mentored over the years. I realized that I wasn't the only person Clara had saved. She had been quietly changing lives all around Jasper for decades. In 1982, I decided to go back to school to become a counselor. I was 39 years old, and it took me 6 years of night classes and weekend courses to get my degree. But I was determined to help other people the way Clara had helped me. I specialized in working with children and families dealing with abuse, and over the next 25 years, I counseled hundreds of people who were struggling with situations similar to what I had survived. The work was hard. Hearing other people's stories of abuse and neglect brought back my own memories in ways that were sometimes overwhelming. But it was also the most meaningful thing I had ever done. When I could look a scared child in the eyes and say, "I believe you and it's not your fault," I could see their relief. When I could tell an adult survivor, "You can heal from this and you can have a good life," I could offer them hope because I was living proof that it was possible. My daughter Clara, now 57 years old, became a social worker herself. She says watching me help other families made her want to continue that legacy. My son Michael is a teacher, and my daughter Sarah works with a nonprofit that provides housing for women escaping domestic violence. None of my children ever experienced the kind of childhood I had, but they all understand the importance of protecting people who can't protect themselves. Now I'm 82 years old, sitting in my living room surrounded by pictures of my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. My granddaughter just had a baby last month, a little girl they named Clara after the woman who changed our family's entire trajectory. 4 generations later, we're still honoring the kindness of a retired school teacher who saw something worth saving in a broken teenage girl at a market in Jasper, Alabama. People ask me sometimes if I ever forgave my mama and my brothers. The truth is, forgiveness was a process that took me years to work through, and some days I still struggle with it. But I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean what they did was okay, and it doesn't mean I have to have a relationship with people who hurt me. It means I refuse to let their cruelty continue poisoning my life. It means I choose to focus on the love I received from Clara and David and my children instead of the hatred I received from Eleanor and my brothers. I share my story now because I want other people to know that surviving abuse doesn't mean you're broken forever. It doesn't mean you can't have healthy relationships or raise healthy children or build a meaningful life. Yes, it changes you. Yes, you carry scars. But those scars can become sources of strength and compassion if you let them. And I want people to understand the power of showing kindness to someone who is hurting. Clara didn't have to stop and help me pick up those coins at the market. She didn't have to invite me for coffee or offer me a safe place to stay. She didn't have to walk into that police station with me or sit through months of testimony at my trial. But she did all of those things, and her kindness literally saved my life and changed the lives of everyone who came after me. If you see someone who looks like they're struggling, if you notice bruises or fear or sadness in someone's eyes, don't look the other way. You don't have to save them. That's not your responsibility. But you can offer them what Clara offered me: belief, safety, and hope. Sometimes that's enough to change everything. I'm 82 years old now, and when I look back on my life, I see a story that could have ended in so many different ways. I could have jumped off that bridge when I was 12. I could have let the anger consume me and become someone who hurt others the way I had been hurt. I could have stayed silent and let my mama and brothers continue their lives without ever facing consequences for what they did to me. But none of those things happened, and the reason they didn't happen comes down to one woman who chose to see me as worth saving. Clara Thompson didn't know when she helped me pick up those coins at the market that she was changing the course of my entire life. She didn't know that her kindness would ripple forward through generations, affecting children and grandchildren who wouldn't be born for decades. She just saw a hurt girl and decided to help. That's all it took. Your past doesn't have to determine your future. I know that sounds simple, maybe even impossible when you're in the middle of your darkest moments. When I was locked in that closet, when I was standing on that bridge, when I was so full of rage I scared myself, I couldn't imagine ever being happy or peaceful or loved. But I was wrong. The pain shaped me, yes. It made me more compassionate, more aware of suffering in others, more determined to protect the vulnerable. But it didn't break me. It didn't stop me from having a beautiful marriage, from raising healthy children, from finding work that gave my life meaning. If you're listening to this and you're in a situation where someone is hurting you, please know that it's not your fault and it doesn't have to be permanent. There are people who will believe you. There are people who will help you. There are Clara Thompsons in this world, and one of them might be closer than you think. And if you're someone who has the power to help someone else, if you see signs of abuse, if you notice someone who seems afraid or hopeless or angry, don't assume it's not your business. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can save a life. Sometimes asking, "Are you okay?" or "How did you get those bruises?" can be the beginning of someone's healing journey. I survived because one person cared enough to get involved. If I can make it through what I went through and build a life full of love and purpose, then you can survive whatever you're facing too. That's not just hope talking. That's the truth I've learned from 8 decades of living. If my story has touched your heart, if it's given you hope or made you think about the power we all have to help each other, then please share it with others who might need to hear it. Subscribe to Grandparents Archives so you can hear more stories from people like me, people who have lived long enough to understand that our hardest experiences often become our greatest sources of wisdom and strength. Share this video with someone who needs to know they're not alone, that healing is possible, that their story doesn't have to end in darkness. Thank you for listening to my truth. Thank you for caring enough about an old woman's story to sit with me for this long. And thank you for believing that stories like mine matter, that they're worth telling, and that they have the power to change lives. Because they do. Clara proved that to me 63 years ago, and I'm still proving it today.